honorable colleagues. I rise today to speak to our Senate Foreign Affairs and International Trade Committee's report entitled, More Than a Vocation, Canada's Need for a 21st Century Foreign Service. I won't repeat what our colleagues and members of the committee have said so far, as they have astutely outlined the content of our report. What I want to speak to is context. I've long been a believer that studies are where the Senate really shows its unique worth. Senators are able to identify issues faced by Canadians, and indeed the international community, and turn those challenges into opportunities and actionable recommendations from a Canadian lens. And with the advantage of institutional memory, senators are able to take into consideration from one administration to the next what worked and what didn't. We have seen groundbreaking studies and reports in past years, such as the still-cited Kirby report on mental health, the Nolan report on cannabis, or the report from the Special Senate Committee on the Arctic from the 42nd Parliament. I would say, somewhat biasedly, that this Foreign Affairs report falls in the same category of diligence and excellence as those to which I have just referred. Colleagues, the subject matter of this report is not sexy, but the importance of the context is invaluable to our public servants working at the Lester Pearson Building, and more importantly, the worldwide network of hundreds of missions. As has been said, it's been four decades since the McDougall Commission produced its recommendation, so an update was well overdue. Yet somehow our committee still came out ahead of the game. We received our order of reference and began our work before the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Honourable Mélanie Joly, announced her Future of Diplomacy review at Global Affairs Canada. Not only were we ahead of the Minister in her internal review, but our report was also completed and deposited with the clerk last December. At that point in time, the Foreign Affairs Committee and the other place had only held their first meeting on a substantially similar study. In fact, their committee invited our Senator Beam as a witness to testify to their study because we had already finished ours. Imagine that. Now's the time for us to put our work into action by adopting this report. The adoption of a report is no menial task. Much work goes into the development of recommendations that can be agreed upon by the majority of our chamber, based on factual witness testimony and pertinent questions from members. The adoption of a report is an assertion by the Senate as a whole to oblige the government to thoughtfully consider our report as pertains to public policy development and the identification of public policy issues and recourses. Our studies hold a certain merit disassociated from partisan leanings found in the House, and they hold up to scrutiny and time. Because of this, we are asking the Minister of Foreign Affairs to provide a detailed and complete response to this report. The response must be tabled by the government representative no later than 150 calendar days after we adopt the report. So the sooner the adoption, the sooner we receive a response. I expect the Minister would be pleased to offer a response considering her own internal review of global affairs. There could be a coordination between the two documents, and I anticipate that has already been initiated. But more than this, the timing of the adoption of our report allows the Minister to officially respond in advance of the 2025 election. An adoption of the report this week, tonight, would mean that an official response in the dead of August at the latest, giving senators ample time to respond to whatever the government might say. This is a useful tool in a democratic governance because it helps the public to understand where the government sits on policy issues. It outlines governmental intentions and provides insights into the balancing act of governance. While foreign relations issues generally don't garner votes, an official response is necessary nonetheless as part of the edification process of those in governance, including ourselves. It allows us to ask tough questions in holding the government to account going forward. Questions to ministers, at committees, and yes, even at the dog and pony show that is our daily question period. But we also need to consider this response with a bit of forethought. The political context we find ourselves in does not lead one to believe that the coffers will be unguarded for increased spending, especially in the foreign context. Certainly, there's a drive for fiscal management underlined with responsibility and prudence. This is in competition with calls counterweighing that same fiscal responsibility. Consider, for example, the Treasury Board directive for ministries to reduce spending amounting to billions of dollars. However, we are also seeing in the media cycle calls for Canada to meet the NATO target of 2% GDP. That money would have to come from somewhere. The reason I raised the 2% NATO contribution threshold is not because I think it's something worth adhering to or that it's even a good metric, but because there has been some indication that one way to achieve the 2% target would be to cut Canada's foreign aid contributions. Colleagues, this is not only short-sighted, it's nonsensical. According to a NATO document entitled Defense Expenditure of NATO Countries, Canada's contributions using the GDP is 1.38%, 25th in NATO. In dollar figures, this is over $39 billion, 9th in NATO. In order to reach the 2% of GDP, Canada would need to contribute roughly another $20 billion, which would only bring us into 5th place if all else remained the same. In comparison, Canada's foreign aid spending in the 2023 federal budget amounted to $6.9 billion, which is approximately 0.24% of our GDP. Colleagues, we would need to contribute around 3 times our entire 2023 foreign aid budget to defense spending just to meet the NATO target and to appease our detractors. Another metric is also used to gauge our contributions to official development assistance, or ODA. This metric is perhaps less known than the NATO target of 2%, but it is also important and was developed by a great Canadian in the mid-20th century. The 1972 Pearson Report, as it is colloquially known, advanced the idea that official development aid should reach 0.7 of gross national income, a different but similar indicator to GDP. Senators Bellemare or Clément could describe the differences in those two points than I could. This target is still being used by organizations such as the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development to track member countries' ODA contributions, but it is based on a percentage of gross national income. In 2022, Canada's ODA as a percentage of gross national income was 0.37%, or roughly half the target of the 0.7% and 18th out of all members of the Development Assistance Committee. But akin to the NATO spending target, Canada jumps to 6th when considering purely dollar figures. Colleagues, it is in this context that the government will have to take our report into account, along with other financial inputs I have mentioned. The theme that emerges is that we simply aren't investing enough or investing smartly in foreign affairs writ large. This is a theme that has persisted for quite some time, and the suspension on recruitment in the Foreign Affairs Department only exacerbated the problems we now see within the Foreign Service. Canada is not a superpower, we are a middle power. And regardless of the musings of those who might claim Canada is broken, we are still a respected power. Reviewing and, where necessary, investing in all aspects of Canada's global presence is necessary, now more than ever. To quote Senator Bean, the world of today is increasingly unstable and violent, with impacts on our trading relationships, supply chains, sovereignty, and our influence around the world, close quote. And was stated in the February 22nd article of The Economist, and I quote, "Russia is becoming more dangerous, America is less reliable, and Europe remains unprepared. Canada's presence in the world must adjust to these ever-changing realities. I fear we risk becoming Canada alone, as Tim Nossel, the distinguished academic at Queen's, has argued." As for Canada's need for a 21st century foreign service, diplomatic experience and expertise are invaluable. Canada's foreign service officers are some of the best in the world, and they deserve our support in order to continue the important diplomacy work that they must do in the face of threats and uncertainties of our global community. The recommendations speak for themselves: recruitment, training, knowledge of development, trade and linguistics, the ability for public servants to apply their skills within the Foreign Service by secondment or interchanges. All of these recommendations would benefit Canada in our middle power role so that we can continue to punch above our weight. Colleagues, only the executive branch, this is in a federation, this is the federal government's unique responsibility. Only the executive branch on behalf of the Crown can conduct foreign affairs by virtue of a power devolved upon it following the UK's enactment of the Statute of Westminster in 1931. This is also known as the royal prerogative, the exercise of which over foreign affairs has been likened to the Supreme Court of Canada as a constitutional responsibility. In Canada versus Catter, paragraph 39, can be interpreted, and I quote, "The constitutional responsibility of the executive is to make decisions on matters of foreign affairs in the context of complex and ever-changing circumstances, taking into account Canada's broader national interests." Colleagues, this is an additional dimension to which Minister Joly will have to judge our report's recommendations. We know that the circumstances are complex, that they are ever-changing. With that in mind, and with foreign affairs power being firmly vested in the federal government's executive, this should take a higher priority from the minister's end and is uniquely her and her cabinet's constitutional role. That being said, colleagues, I ask that we undertake and report out this report tonight. I understand there's agreement to do that, so that we might receive a formal response from the minister as soon as possible. Thank you.
Senator Cormier.
Senator Cormier. Inaudible. Senator Cormier.
I will ask my question in French. Premièrement,
First of all, I'd like to congratulate you and congratulate the committee on this absolutely essential, excellent, fundamental report, I think, for the Foreign Service of Canada. I read it carefully, and I read the recommendations carefully, particularly number 6, Senator Harder, that says in foreign affairs policies that require input from countless ministers, the Government of Canada should clearly state the role of each one and also which department would be involved in charge of coordination and ensuring quality. The government should also define what the Foreign Affairs Department can play in key issues. I recently read the report on cultural diplomacy. I read it again, in fact, and I've noticed that there are many parallels with this report. Do you think that in the study that the government, or that the examination that the government makes of this report, it should also take into account what was published in the cultural policy report?
At the outset, that the earlier report on cultural diplomacy is one that I very much embraced, and I commend the committee for that work. Cultural diplomacy, when I was the Deputy Minister serving 3 different governments in that role at Foreign Affairs, was an important part of how Canada projects itself and influences. This report is more about the plumbing, if I could put it that way, of the department, but certainly the tool of cultural diplomacy is one that we ought to embrace, and is one that the report builds on as a result of the study that was earlier conducted by our committee and to which you referred.